Alright, this will not be the most uplifting module, but we need to spend some time talking about the difficulties that can occur in relationships. Again, not all relationships are the same. Some of these will refer to difficulties in marriage, some will refer to the aftermath of divorce, and some can occur in actually any type of relationship. So again, this is just the difficult, negative part of relationships, so kind of buckle up. This will not be the most uplifting module. But understanding these things and these issues can actually lead to happiness and help you prevent some problems. So there's that. Let's go. The first learning outcome for this module is to identify kind of 4 vulnerable areas in relationships, especially marriage. Again, it's not to say that these things cause divorce, but these are areas that can be especially problematic. The first is gaps in role expectations. When I was a kid, it was just kind of assumed that my mother would stay at home and cook and clean, and my father would go to work and do all the bills and finances and all that stuff. That was just the norm. That's what people in my town agreed upon. Everybody felt that way. It's just the way that things were. Today, you're seeing a lot of shifts in role expectations. It's increasingly common for women to have careers outside of the home. It's more common for men to share household chores and to not be so driven by those older stereotypes of what husbands and wives should do. The vulnerable area comes not from either one of those, but when there are differences in the role expectations. In other words, if the one partner thinks that this is what they should be doing and the other partner disagrees, that's where the source of conflict goes. My parents have been married for a very long time with the traditional ways, and there are very many successful, happy relationships and marriages today with kind of the newer roles. So what matters is that you share the same ideas about what those roles should be, not necessarily what they are. The next is work issues, career issues. Again, not just the type of work that someone's doing, but how much time they're spending away from home. That can be men, that can be women, that can be anyone in the relationship. Obviously, if someone is really devoted to their career, spends a lot of time with it, one partner might feel neglected, one partner might have more duties in terms of the relationship, so that can be a source of stress. The workplace itself is stressful, and those issues can kind of bleed into the marriage or the relationship. But some research suggests that it's actually beneficial for both partners to have a career, some kind of different outlet for their life and for their energy. So it doesn't always have to be a bad thing, but it can be a source of conflict for sure. The next is financial difficulties. Again, this is a problem for many of us, whether we're single or dating or married. But especially in a relationship, financial stability can be problematic, especially if you share finances, if you're going through a difficult time, or if you have disagreements about how you should be spending your finances. A friend of mine's relationship broke apart for no other reason than their partner was spending money in a way they did not agree with, and so their marriage ended. So financial difficulties obviously can be a very vulnerable area as well. And then finally, inadequate communication. Hopefully you're seeing a theme in this course that communication pops up in almost every module because of how valuable it is. This course is called Human Relations, and the biggest way we do that is communicating with each other. So if you're not effectively talking about how you feel, if you're not effectively trying to engage in that conflict management that we've talked about this semester, obviously that can be a vulnerable area in your marriage. So gaps in role expectations, workplace issues, financial difficulties, and inadequate communication, all 4 of which can be vulnerable areas in marital satisfaction. Okay, next up is divorce. And again, I've never been through a divorce, and I don't want to come across like I know what that feels like just because the textbook and the research suggests something. That doesn't mean that will be your experience. So again, just kind of take this information as you will. Some of it is very contradictory itself, but it can be insightful into helping you understand how some people deal with a divorce, which is the legal dissolution of a marriage. Divorce can do a lot of things. It can include a lot of changes, but there's 5 specific characteristics of divorce that I want you to be familiar with. The first is related to divorce rates. You have to be really careful with this because I've heard so many statistics about the likelihood of divorce and how likely you are to have a divorce. You have to be very, very careful with those statistics. One study suggested that 1 of 3 marriages ends in divorce. I heard that once, and what that particular study didn't take into account is that some of those same people were divorcing. So it's not as if 1/3 of people were divorcing. It's just that some of those people were divorcing a lot, and so their marriages were counting more than the others. So why am I telling you this? Because I just want you to be very skeptical of divorce rates. They are higher than they used to be, and there is less of a stigma about divorce, as we'll talk about in a couple other issues as well. So that's divorce rates. The next is the actual practice of deciding on a divorce. It's not as if couples wake up or someone wakes up one morning and decides that they should get a divorce. It's usually characteristic of long issues or longer thoughts of being unhappy in the relationship. Some couples will decide to divorce, change their mind, go back and do it. Again, it's just a more complicated process than you might imagine if you haven't been through it yourself. Again, that stigma of divorce has declined, and that's actually a good thing. Can divorce be difficult to deal with? Absolutely. We'll talk about some ways in just a second. But staying in an unhappy marriage, actually research suggests, is much worse than getting a divorce. Research suggests that people who are unhappily married have poor physical health, lower levels of happiness, lower life satisfaction, lower self-esteem. So it's not to say that divorce is always a bad thing. Some marriages ending in divorce actually has benefits for one or maybe even both parties. So again, I always like to say that I grew up in an environment where divorce was such a stigma. Someone in my church told my sister once that divorce was always wrong all the time, and if she got a divorce, she'd go to hell. And my sister, who was very intelligent and feisty, said, what if my husband abuses me or cheats on me or has an affair? And the response was, well, you should have known that before you married him. You can think whatever you want to about that, but many people today, mostly researchers that we're talking about, conclude that being unhappy in a marriage is not preferable to being unhappy with a divorce. So again, just make sure you're aware of that process of deciding on the divorce too. Next characteristic is adjusting to the divorce. Obviously, every couple handles that differently. Some of the trends you'll want to know: women are more likely to take more of a role in raising children. If there are children involved, men usually lose time and closeness with the children in terms of physical closeness. Economic consequences can be damaging for both parties. They're usually more damaging for women, but again, as traditional roles in marriages are changing, men are more affected by a divorce financially as well. Divorces are expensive. A lot of people don't know that, especially if there's lawyers or years of litigation involved. So there definitely can be issues there. In terms of emotional adjustment, there's lots of ideas about who might be more affected, but research suggests that there aren't really any gender differences in terms of emotional adjustment to marriage. Next characteristic has to do with the effects of divorce on children. Again, be careful with this research because there have been some studies that show this. Those studies are critiqued years later. Other studies show this. The one thing I want to stress is that divorce can have harmful effects on children, but so can staying in an unhappy marriage. So we're not really talking about the issue of divorce as much as we're talking about the quality of the relationship both before and after. Many couples decide to divorce but make a commitment to the children, and the children are not negatively affected at all. Many couples stay unhappily married, and that kind of negativity and anger, perhaps even abuse, can definitely have problems on the children. So again, this is one of those things where the research is interesting, but it often contradicts itself, and there's no definitive word on how divorce affects children because those are such broad statements to make. What matters to me and probably to you is if you divorce, how will that affect your children? One way it might is through the last characteristic of divorce, and this has to do with remarriage and step families. Again, research is all over the place with this. Some research suggests that there might be less cohesion, less feelings of togetherness, maybe more negative interactions between stepchildren and stepparents. But again, that doesn't mean that even when it exists, that's going to be an unhealthy relationship. It might just be a transitional period. And again, there's plenty of blended families where this is not an issue at all. So again, take these research trends with a grain of salt. Recognize what scientists and psychologists have studied, but then recognize the flaws with these types of studies as well, because they are present. The final learning outcome in this module has to do with IPV, which stands for intimate partner violence. Now, before I get into this, let me just tell you that if this is something that you're currently experiencing, there are resources available out there for you, both locally and nationally and globally. So if that's something that I could be of help with in terms of getting you resources, by all means, feel free to contact me. It's a very difficult thing if you've never been through it. It's often very complicated, but in terms of this learning outcome, just be familiar with what IPV is and also the characteristics of both the people who are doing the violence and the people who are being abused. So intimate partner violence is any aggression towards someone that you're in a close relationship with. We used to call this domestic violence, but it doesn't just occur in marriages or even with people who live together. So again, intimate partner violence allows us to have a more encompassing discussion of people who are affected by this. It is tough to get incident rates on IPV because a lot of people don't come forward with it. A lot of people don't even label it as intimate partner violence. It can be physical, it can also be sexual, or even psychological. You can do a lot of damage to somebody without ever touching them. So IPV, it can be difficult to see how often it's occurring. It is overwhelmingly more likely to occur to a woman, but it can occur from a woman to a man, or from woman to woman, or man to man. It just depends on the situation. In terms of what people who engage in intimate partner violence look like, in terms of people who we call batterers, you cannot identify them just by looking at them. They're often very well liked, not just by the person they're in a relationship with, but also by their friends and their family. It's very common for people to say, "I can't believe that that person was abusive." But sometimes there are risks you can look for, some characteristics that make you a little bit elevated risk for engaging in domestic violence are unemployment, drinking, drug use, getting angry easily, condoning aggression, being abused as a child, being jealous in your relationships, having unrealistic expectations. Again, none of those things mean you will abuse your spouse or your partner. They just elevate the risk that you will. There's a lot of people who think that if you were abused as a child, you will definitely abuse either your children or your spouse. Most people do not. Let me say that again. Most people who are abused do not abuse, but it does elevate your risk of doing so. So if that's something you've been through, you just want to keep an eye on your anger, on your temperament, on how you treat the people around you. In terms of characteristics of the people being abused, a lot of times folks wonder why you would stay in an abusive relationship. For one thing, a lot of people don't. We kind of have this cultural perception that happens a lot. A lot of people who are being abused leave. They just don't talk about it, or it doesn't get as much attention. But some people do stay in abusive relationships, and unfortunately it's because of a lack of control they feel. Sometimes they are very financially dependent, or dependent on this person for their home, so they fear becoming homeless or extremely poor. Some people don't want the judgment of leaving someone, especially if it's a marriage. Again, divorce still has some stigma, and a lot of times people blame the victim. Probably one of the saddest reasons people stay is because they are legitimately afraid that their partner will kill them, or maybe their children, or just some horrible negative outcome. And that does happen, which is why it's so important, if you or someone you know is dealing with this, to find out what the local resources are. And again, if I can help with that, definitely feel free to contact me, and I'll give you as much information as I can. We definitely have local resources, and your textbook gives you some tips on how to kind of deal with these situations as well. So I hope that none of you ever go through that. Unfortunately, I know that some of you probably already have. But if you do, I just hope that you know that help is out there, and you use me if I can help you at all.